Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to this webinar series, Explorations in Translation for Children, convened by the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing here at the University of Reading in the UK and outside in Wales. And tonight we're very excited to host for our last webinar for 2025, this seminar on the very exciting project publishing children's books in the Russia-Ukraine war, and its researcher is going to talk to us about the role of translations, particularly in their findings on that. So before we introduce our speakers, just a couple of things. First of all, just to let you know that this is being recorded, but do make good use of the chat, which isn't being recorded, and let us know where you're joining us from. And that's where you can put questions and comments in here for the question and answer session as we are moderating it for you. Okay, without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Patricia. Okay. Patricia seems to have left us briefly. I'm so sorry about that. But just to let you know that this is very much an interdisciplinary webinar, all exploring around the idea of translation and children's books. And we're really excited to work with Outside in Worlds, the organisation that promotes children's literature in translation and international children's literature. Okay, so what I'll do then is introduce our speakers. First of all, we're going to hear from Birgitte Beck Pristed, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Global Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark, and she is the Principal Investigator on this project. She's going to be joined by Nadia Pavlyk, who is a researcher on the project and Professor at Zhytomyr Ivan Franko State University in Ukraine. And her main research areas focus on youth policy, youth work, and non-formal education. And she's also a researcher on the Marie Curie for Ukraine funded project, Dialogues and Reading, shared reading for Ukrainian young people. And then we'll be hearing from Ekaterina Shatalova, who's a PhD fellow on the project, and she's also a prolific translator of children's books and TV shows. And she holds a master's degree in Victorian literature from Oxford, and also an Erasmus Mundus International Master's degree in children's literature, media and culture from the Universities of Glasgow, Tilburg and Aarhus University. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Birgitte. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you to you, Sophie and Patricia, for organizing this webinar series. We've been looking forward to meeting other translation-interested audiences here today. So in this joint talk, I will first give you a brief introduction to a research project which currently runs at Aarhus University from 2024 to 27, and it's called Publish Children's Books in the Russia-Ukraine War. And then my colleague Nadia Pavlyk will share selected findings from her part of this project, in which she conducted interviews with the Ukrainian children's book publishers to discuss the importance of international networks for the publishers' capacity to produce and translate war-themed literature for children. And finally, our second colleague, Ekaterina Shatalova, will discuss how translated children's books became politically charged objects in Russia today. So just to start, our project has a twofold aim. It examines how Ukrainian and Russian children's book publishers operate under wartime conditions characterized by destroyed publishing infrastructures and staff shortages in Ukraine and economic and political pressures in Russia. So what are publishers' motivation for bringing out war-themed literature, or for not publishing such literature? And then the second question is how the resulting children's books reflect child researchers' experiences of war and dislocation. So the first question we ask in this project is related to book and publishing studies, while the second question is more a classical representation problem that known from literary studies. So as you can see, this project is not per se a linguistic or a translation studies project, but both of these research questions obviously involve translation aspects at more levels. So just to understand what I would call the geopolitics of translating children's books in the Russia-Ukraine war, I will here try to give you a short background for understanding how the war has affected language policies within the publishing industry, and how it has changed the book market in Ukraine and Russia in the time period we are examining from the Donbass war started in 2014 to present. So until the Maidan revolution, Russia and Ukraine were each other's biggest trade partners within the publishing industry, but this trade was certainly not even or equal because the cultural industry was characterized by strong power asymmetries between Russian and Ukrainian languages and the possibilities for translation to and from those languages. So the Ukrainian book market was dominated by Russian publishing conglomerates, and it was cheaper to produce and sell Russian language books on the Ukrainian market. So in 2013, before the war started, books in Russian language counted for around 75% of the market in Ukraine. But in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea and the war outbreak in Donbass, there was a heightened cultural and national awareness of in Ukraine of Russian linguistic dominance, and this meant that Russian book sales to Ukraine fell sharply in the following decade to less than 10% of the pre-war sales. And this was not only due to the territorial losses and occupation of Russian-speaking or mainly Russian-speaking regions in Donbass and Crimea, it was also because Ukrainian consumer boycotts of Russian books and changing reading habits and preferences changed from below. Together with governmental funding initiatives, the establishment of the Ukrainian Book Institute and the introduction of trade sanctions against Russian mass cultural products that were introduced from above. And this resulted in a changed book market. And today, since the full-scale invasion in 22, all book imports from both Russia and Belarus are banned in Ukraine, and Ukrainian publishers are prohibited from publishing books in Russian. And this means that Ukrainian children's book publishers who long struggled with this asymmetric competition and language dominance from the side of the Russian publishing industry have cut ties with the Russian counterparts. Obviously, the current war situation in the two countries is not comparable, or it does not create different sets of challenges for the publishers in each country. So in Ukraine, publishers face immense production challenges caused by direct attacks on civic infrastructure and energy grids and so on. In the Russia bordering city of Kharkiv, which is called the capital of Ukraine's book and publishing industry. This city has been particularly hard hit, and major printing facilities have been destroyed and also later rebuilt. And the Ukrainian publishers, they also struggle with staff that is either displaced or mobilized, rising production costs, declining purchasing power, mass displacement of children. Many children have been forced to move abroad for safety reasons, but international distribution networks are underdeveloped, and this makes it very difficult for the publishers to continue reaching their primary readership. So on the other hand, Ukrainian publishers have experienced increased international and Western interest in translating their children's books to a wider Western audience. However, they still face many hurdles in bringing out the books across borders, because despite this public interest, there are still many institutional and structural barriers for translating Ukrainian children's books. For example, in a small country like Denmark, where our university is situated, no university program of Ukrainian language and literature exists, and this means that there are no professional translators who can translate from Ukrainian into a small language like Danish. And Nadia will return to some of those challenges in her presentation. And on the Russian side, the children's book publishers are challenged by international and domestic pressures, trade sanctions, cultural boycotts in the West, inflation, escalating production costs, and political pressures and censorship. So Russian publishers have become internationally isolated from the West, and Russian language and literature has experienced also a loss of symbolic and cultural status. This notion of a myth of the great Russian literature has lost moral legitimacy among a broader reading audiences. And it's interesting if the study of a marginalized genre as children's literature can contribute to a deconstruction of that myth of great literature. So at least a handful of Russian language children's book publishers who oppose the warfare regime have been able, owing to their niche status, to continue operating in Russia as part of the country's few remaining independent media outlets. But since 2022, these publishers have also faced an exodus, both of their skilled staff, but also a loss of their core market segment, namely the educated opposition-minded parents and their children. So these publishers are also struggling to continue operating across national borders and balancing politically between the exile audiences and audiences in a transnational context, and then the political institution and authorities inside Russia. And Ekaterina will return to that in her presentation. And then the second part of our project and the second question involves also a language and translation problem, which is not taking place at the structural or institutional level, but it's a more abstract question related to the classic problem of the possibility of representing war with words. Like, who has the rights or the words to say anything about the war, and how can you explain or translate war to children? And this is perhaps a question of intralingual translation rather than translation proper. Like, what language should you use? Should you even try to do it? Can adults translate children's war experiences into a literary expression without reducing child experiences and perspectives? And of course, there's a large research literature on this dilemma, that on the one hand, war is unspeakable, war is disorder, and resist language attempts to create order and context and meaning. So neither children nor adult literature authors or us as researchers are in a position where we are able to say anything about the war, especially when we are far removed from the front lines ourselves. And on the other hand, there's this moral imperative that we must address the war and name it and bear witness to it instead of silencing it. So the special thing about this project is that we are working with children's books that are being published here and now. So it is war-themed literature in the making. And this means that we still lack the often retrospective interpretive frameworks, which are already established if you deal with children's books about historical wars. So we do not yet know which of the books that we collect, which will become the future children's book classics. Some of the books we have collected have artistic aspirations, other are like pure propaganda booklets. And I just want to show you that we have collected a book corpus of more than 100 war-themed children's books in Ukrainian and Russian, and they have been published from 2014 to present. And the majority of these books are now being catalogued in the International Children's Book Collection in the Danish Pedagogical University Library, so they will also be accessible for research after the project and to the public. And then we also have our own private collections and grey literature that has been difficult to get access to, for example, from the occupied territories. And I just want to give you a glimpse of what types of materials we are working with. Here are Ukrainian examples of war-themed children's books. They are, it's not an attempt at creating a typology or anything. I just wanted to show you a spectrum of the varied materials. If I should generalize about it, we could say that it's important in these books that the war is named, that it's place specific often, because the books document the war as it takes place. Some of the books have a practical survival guide function as mine safety books for children. Some books have national or patriotic content with heroic stories with clear us and them. Other literature is therapeutic and deals with trauma and losses. We also have religious themed resistance literature with spiritual content in our collection, and we have fantasy genres, entertainment literature that still deals with the war. And then we also have artistic picture books often addressed at an international audience. Often it is the picture books that have success at the international exhibitions and book fairs and get translated into other languages, while the national narratives are more oriented towards a domestic audience. And finally, I just want to show you a short spectrum of the war-themed literature in the corpus from Russian language publishers. The collection includes both like anti-war literature that does not name the war directly, but make use of paraphrases, allegories, dystopias, satire, to reword the war, because it's prohibited to use the word war about the war against Ukraine. But we have also collected nationalist, neo-imperialist sea literature used for patriotic education for young and old, to document that this is also taking place. And we have also collected translated literature and literature that addresses war-related migration. And in addition to the book corpus, we have conducted interviews with children's book publishers. And I will now stop sharing my slides and leave the word to Nadia, who will then explain about her part of the project and the interviews with the Ukrainian children's book publishers.
Thank you, Birgitte. The full-scale Russian invasion radically reshaped the ecosystem of children's books in Ukraine. The war affected not only what was published, but also how publishing houses operated, how they collaborated, and how Ukrainian books circulated internationally. In this context, translation became not just a cultural practice, but a key survival strategy enabling international visibility for Ukrainian publishing. International networks of support became crucial infrastructure. They allowed publishers to continue operating, to tell children's story under conditions of uncertainty, and to make Ukrainian voices visible abroad. As one publisher explained, without international partners, we would not have survived the first months. This testimony points to a transformation of publishing from a purely commercial activity into a field deeply embedded in humanitarian, political, and emotional economies. Based entirely on publishers' own experiences, I will show how international support did not simply help Ukrainian children's books, but played a central role in making the continued production and international presence of Ukrainian children's books possible. My part of research is based on interviews that we conducted in spring and summer 2024 within the Publish project. In total, 8 Ukrainian publishers took part. Participation was voluntary. I sent open invitation to the official email addresses published on the website. Those who responded and agreed became part of the study. The publishers who took part represent different types of children's publishing in Ukraine. Participants are different in size, experience, niche publishing portfolios. For example, 3 participants, Kangaroo, Crocus, and Ranok, work in Kharkiv, a frontline city, exposed to constant shelling and large-scale displacement. Old Lion and Svichada operate in Lviv, farther from active hostilities, which provides more stable infrastructure, but also increased pressure to serve displaced people. All publishers have struggled with blackouts, logistical issues, and a lack of printing facilities. Large publishers with broad catalogs such as Old Lion and Ranok operate with bigger teams and established international ties. Small houses, for example, Teza, Crocus, Tut, operate with very small teams and limited resources, which affects translation capacity, participation in book fairs, and ability to maintain continuous production during wartime. Taken together, these publishers demonstrate that the field is highly fragmented. Access to translators, international rights trading, financial stability, and even physical safety varies widely. Some depend on translation, while others work almost only with Ukrainian authors. And this diversity is central to understanding how Ukrainian children's books are created, translated, and shared internationally today. Two short cases from the interview help to reveal the deeper structure shaping Ukrainian children's publishing before the war. One publisher described negotiations with Disney, where the corporation initially failed to understand the difference between Ukraine and Russia. The problem was not only geographical, but systemic. Ukraine was not perceived as an independent publishing territory, but only as a linguistic variant within a Russian-centered model. These cases matter because they expose structural invisibility. Before 2022, Ukraine functioned in global publishing flows not as a distinct market, but as a linguistic margin of the Russian sphere. National borders were blurred by language policies. Russian publishing practices shaped access to translation, and Ukrainian children's books struggled to enter global circuits. These conditions formed the background against which wartime changes later occur. Before the full-scale invasion, publishers consistently described Ukrainian translation infrastructure as weak and uneven. Russian functioned as a dominant language, not only within Ukraine, but across the post-Soviet space. They sold their books in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. Their print runs cannot be compared to ours. This created a double dependency. Regionally, Ukrainian publishers depended on Russian language chains of production and distribution. Globally, they depended on English as the main source language for translation. As one publisher noted, there is no problem with translator from English, while at the same time, the whole English language market worked primarily for export. Languages outside this hierarchy were described as almost inaccessible. Translators from small languages such as Swedish, Norwegian, Dutch, or Icelandic were either very few or almost non-existent. With Icelandic, for example, we have one translator, and that's it. At the same time, translation from Ukrainian into other languages was extremely limited, and sometimes the same person worked in both directions. Editors often could not read original languages and therefore relied on author reputations rather than textual evaluation. I cannot read Swedish, but I know that Rose Lagercrantz cannot write badly, and this created a dependency on symbolic capital instead of direct literary assessment, further narrowing the diversity of translated literature. 24 February 2022 marked as infrastructural collapse. The book market froze. We were not sure if we could publish even one book. Paper was unavailable, logistics stopped, bookstore closed, and staff were displaced. Many publishers shifted from cultural production to emergency practices, evacuation of people, saving archives, and physical survival. In this vacuum, international support became a substitute infrastructure. Publishers spoke about foreign partners who printed Ukrainian books at their own cost for refugee children. This was not standard market logic, but rather a hybrid from a humanitarian publishing practice. The war also reactivated dormant international relations. Publishers described cases where companies that had previously refused cooperation now actively proposed partnership. Ukraine, let's work together. Distributors such as ProLit in Germany provided access to retail networks that had been structurally closed to Ukrainian books before. Book fairs functioned as symbolic accelerator. In 2022, Ukraine became highly visible. Later, this visibility had to be actively maintained through catalogs, personal communication, and long-term professional relationships. Financial and institutional support from European programs, Creative Europe, House of Europe, Tales of Ukraine, and national cultural funds provided resources for translation and promotion. The Ukrainian Book Institute played an important role in supporting translation and international visibility. Publisher describes Translate Ukraine program as a key entry point for foreign partners interested in Ukrainian books. Importantly, publishers also highlighted the role of readers, authors, and translators as moral infrastructure. Readers bought books as act of support. Creators worked for Ukrainian rights while living abroad. Some authors combined frontline experience with literary work. This extended publishing beyond industry into the sphere of civic and emotional labor. Rather than a linear transformation, wartime publishing is characterized by permanent instability. As one publisher stated, everything has changed several times. It is constantly changing. This continuous uncertainty forced publishers to adopt flexible, adaptive strategies. One major trend was increased international attention to Ukrainian books, accompanied by higher sales and visibility. The ban of Russian language books created an urgent demand for Ukrainian language translation. Right trading shifted geographically. Before 2022, licenses were mainly sold to neighboring countries. After the invasion, the market expanded rapidly to Western Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. Publishers described a new emotional mode of decision-making, not confidence, but a form of a brave uncertainty. Expensive participation in fairs was framed as an existential decision. We don't know what will happen tomorrow. At the same time, publishers faced serious losses. A large number of children left the country and publishing houses lost their readers. As a result, many publishers shifted their portfolios from children's books to adult literature in order to survive, because children's books started to look like a luxury. Another structural problem during the war has been very small print runs. Because costs concentrate in the first 1,000 copies, publishers cannot lower prices. Wartime publishing produced a split audience: Ukrainian children and international readers. For Ukrainian children, publishers emphasized the importance of recognizable realities. Books functioned as tools for self-understanding, emotional processing, the identity formation in conditions of loss, displacement, and uncertainty. Publishers described a shift from direct depictions of violence, which caused public backlash, to trauma-aware forms. These books are expected to be existential. They should help children see themselves, their families, and their disrupted normality in narrative form. Publishers believe that future literature will need to address these topics more deeply. This is our reality. This is our mentality. This is what children see. Translated books are more universal. They exist everywhere, but these books are directly ours, and they reflect our life. At the same time, for international readers, translation becomes a filter of readability. Some books travel easily, especially metaphorical and wordless formats. Silent books were described as particularly successful because emotional communication does not depend on language. Other books depend too much on Ukrainian cultural codes. One publisher mentioned a book, The Cat, the Rooster, and the Cupboard, saying that they are not sure how understandable it is outside Ukraine. International partners often look for universal stories, but this can push Ukrainian publishers to soften specific Ukrainian experiences. This tension shapes contemporary Ukrainian children's literature between speaking truthfully about local experience and making that experience legible abroad. As one publisher summarized, every book is about love, kindness, and something good. Any book can be called patriotic if it is in the native language, with good translation and good editing. Children don't want to read about rockets and bombs. They want to read about princesses. Behind this statement lies a long-term aspiration to move from survival through solidarity to a stable presence of Ukrainian children's books in many languages and many cultural spaces. Many publishers dream about a future where Ukrainian books are translated into many, many languages. Thank you.
Is it working? Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. So what does it take for a children's book to become a national security threat? In today's Russia, it can be as little as a little soldier taking off his helmet or a cartoon general who fails to keep everyone on the right side of the page. In my talk, I want to do three things. Wait, where did it go? Yes. First, sketch the hybrid censorship environment around children's books since 2022. Second, show how translated titles have been mobilized as both resistance and evidence of treason. And finally, ask what this means for the way we theorize translation as political act in wartime. On paper, censorship in Russia is still prohibited by the constitution. In practice, since February 22, we've seen a rapid securitization of free speech when even using the word war could land you in prison for up to 15 years under the new laws against spreading fake information about the Russian army. And the first targets were not children's books as such, but authors, and mostly of adult literature, and their perceived ideological reliability, which would change within the span short of just next 3 years. Children's publishing always had a different trajectory in Russia. Post-Soviet Russian children's literature has never been a censorship-free zone. After a brief period of relative openness in the 90s, that's when we get the major influx of translations from the West, the state moved to reassert control in 2011. That's when Putin started his narrative on traditional values. And the federal law titled On the Protection of Children from Information Harmful to Their Health and Development was introduced, which imposed strict limitations on content deemed potentially damaging to minors. Effectively, it pushed out of the children's field a wide range of themes such as historical, personal trauma, mental health issues, death and grief, physical mental disabilities, bullying, abuse, sexual violence, LGBTQ identities and experiences, drug use, and other complex sensitive subjects, which significantly reshaped the landscape of children's and YA literature in the country. At the same time, this pre-war regime was still qualitatively different from the post-2022 situation. The 2011 law was framed as moral and psychological protection, not as national security. Enforcement was uneven, and publishers learned to play this age rating system. Contemporary politics and foreign influences were not yet the primary focus of the scrutiny. So while the field was heavily regulated, it was still possible, especially for small independent houses, to publish books that complicated official narratives of history, identity, and violence. And so this little lag between morality-based control regime and full secularization of culture created this small fragile window after February 2022 that independent children's publishers tried to use for counter-narratives. And one of the most striking examples is Moscow-based independent publisher Samokat, who on 3rd March 2022, days after the invasion, announced on their Instagram a new translation of the picture book War by José Jorge Letría and André Letría. The rights for this book were bought in 2021. The translation was finished by November, the book was ready by mid-February, and instead of delaying it, they decided to go on with it, but with very minimum advertising campaign. Across their social media, over all these years, there are only 2 posts, and the rest is just among selections of other war-related books. That very first post, and you can see translation on the slide, attracted thousands of likes and comments saying, "You are our heroes." And the very first hashtag under the announcement reads, "Russia is a terrorist state," which the publisher decided not to delete. And the book is thus no longer just a universal anti-war picture book, but a gesture of resistance and cultural solidarity, as well as a proxy space where readers perform their own resistance in the comments. And Samokat is not alone. Other Russian children publishers, whether they have signed open anti-war petitions or not, still find ways to publish and market books about the current war. And they can do it by reprinting relevant titles from back catalogs. For example, Compass Git reissues Brown Morning, an anti-fascist fable about a society that bans all colors except brown. It was first published in Russian in 2011. The new 2022 edition is sold out by early 25, and the theater adaptation in Moscow sells out repeatedly. Another way is commissioning translations of Holocaust and Second World War books, as these books offer a language of historical trauma and genocide that contemporary readers can silently map onto the present. Reprinting some Soviet war books, and finally, we have civic-related nonfiction books, both translations and commissions. For example, biographies of dissidents, books on democracy, protest, fake news, etc. These are not books about war in Ukraine on the surface, but they frame political action, responsibility, and state violence in ways that are legible in the current moment. So basically, publishers use translation here as a kind of a ethical smuggling. So they import existing discourses of war, fascist resistance, and civil courage, rather than naming the current conflict directly. It's both safer and in some ways more dangerous because it invites analogies that cannot be easily policed textually. At least it wasn't this up until recently. So this brings us to the securitization question, the process by which state or parastate actors frame something as a security threat to collective survival in order to justify exceptional measures. In 2024, Nikolai Nilov, then head of the freshly established Children's Book Council of the Union of Writers, announced that 60% of children's books on the Russian market were destructive. According to him, we are all fighting and they are publishing destructive books. He presents this as a cunning strategy by Western intelligence services and cultural institutions and foundations such as ABBY, who are supposedly working together with complicit Russian publishers. Apart from the usual familiar to us moral panic surrounding books about bodies, bodily functions, deaths, gender roles, etc., Nilo's expert group goes further and constructs a taxonomy of danger under the heading of betrayal. He presents two titles, the two picture books, The Little Soldier and Don't Cross the Line as Objects of Scandals. So let's look at the first one, The Little Soldier by Cristina Belemo and Veronica Rufato, published in Russian by Polyandria in 2023. Marked 0+, this anti-war tale follows a little soldier who has been taught only to march, aim, and shoot until a quiet encounter in a stranger's cozy home prompts him to remove his helmet. Re-emerging as a naive, frightened child, he discovers that there is also such thing as peace, not just war. And the particular outrage in this book has centered on a single line, quote, "The little soldier took off his uniform and nobody accused him of being a deserter," end of quote. For Nina Ostanina, the chair of the State Duma Committee on Family Protection, the book, quote, instills false ideas and values in a child, irresponsibility, a tendency to betrayal, the acceptability of desertion, and the discrediting of military service. She stresses that Little Soldier is being distributed in a large print run during the military operation in Ukraine, which is unacceptable. In other words, a picture book that invites very young readers to imagine a soldier child stepping out of violence is redefined as a manual in treason. The second example, pardon me, is even more absurd. Don't Cross the Line by Isabel Minos Martins and Bernardo Carvalho, published in Russian by Samokat in 2023. Almost wordless and openly allegorical, this book tells of an army general who orders a guard to keep the right-hand page of the book blank. As the story unfolds, a crowd of characters build up along the gutter and desperate to move into the empty space. And eventually, people power wins, and the crowd spills across the border, and the general is overthrown. For Nilo's expert team, however, this is not a playful postmodern meditation on dictatorship and peaceful revelation, but a story discrediting the general's authority and in particular, the Russian army. Why Russian, you would ask? Completely disregarding that this is a translation of a book rooted in Portuguese context, they decided that since the soldier is labeled soldier depicted on the end papers, where all 60 characters are presented with their names. So this soldier is labeled in translation Comrade Soldier. And the general at the bottom of the page wears the same color uniform. So in their logic, they both Russian. And even the name of the horse, of the general's horse, the Rusty Rocket, in their reading elevated as a deliberate act of humiliation devised by ideological opponents. In their hunt for rage bait, a creative translation decision becomes evidence and helps to distort the entire book and its context. The quote on the back cover, let me go back for a sec. It's not going back. Yes. The quote saying, "Nothing depends on the soldier, he unquestionably obeys the orders of the general." So this line becomes a lightning rod for indignation, as they interpret it as an intolerable negative connotation applied to a soldier whose very job is to follow orders. So once again, an anti-authoritarian fable about civic courage and the absurdity of power is recorded as propaganda. And the very same foreigners that made this book strategically useful and safe at first to independent publishers is now being actively erased in order to treat them as direct text on Russia. Just a sec. Yes. And securization does not stop at the level of text. It extends to people who produce them, just as it was with the authors of adult literature in the beginning of the war. In June 2025, the human rights activist and translator Alexandra Polivanova was designated a foreign agent status. For the context, this status can be given to any person or organization receiving any form of support from outside of Russia or deemed to be under foreign influence. And so within days, 4 of Sven Nordqvist's beloved Petson and Findus books, the translation that she translated 20 years ago, were temporarily removed from sale and then later reappeared, as you can see on the slide, shrink-wrapped, blasted with a foreign agent disclaimer, and reclassified as 18+. Under Russian IP law, translators are recognized as co-authors, and that legal framework, designed to credit creative labor, becomes a tool of contamination. So the translator's new political status infects a long-established children's series and symbolically expels it from the sphere of childhood. So what we see here is the logic of danger transferred, pushed to its limit. The problem, from the perspective of the state, is not what is being translated, but also who is doing the translation. And ironically, we've all been fighting so hard for translators' names to appear on the cover, but now the translator's name is a security label. So translation scholars like Brian Bayer have written about translation as a site of resistance in late Soviet culture, a place where oppositional or subversive content could be encoded in such a way that it was accessible to the intended reader, but vague or at least uninteresting to the censor. For this to work, Bayer argues you need several things: authorial tension, encoded oppositional content, a double audience, insiders who can decode, outsiders who can't. But what happens when your censors are more attentive or simply more paranoid than your child readers, when they assume subversive decoding even when none was intended? So children's literature complicates Bayer's model in at least two ways. First, the dual audience means that every text is already double-voiced. What counts as subversive may be entirely different for each audience. A child might read Don't Cross the Line as a slapstick chaos, where an adult censor reads it as a color revolution. And second, the translator's role is split between moral and political resistance. Translators and publishers can and do understand themselves as serving eternal values like peace, human dignity, memory, rather than the shifting demands of the state. But in securitized environment, like today's Russia, even non or apolitical ethical choices are read as political. And so, on the one hand, translation is a vehicle for ethical resistance and memory work. On the other hand, it becomes liability that invites exceptional measures such as moral panic, public denunciation, reclassification, shrink-wrapping, last-minute exclusions from book fairs, and criminalization of the people whose names appear on the title page. I think that's all from me. I just want to say that next year there will be a conference on censorship, and if you're interested to know what's happening with censorship in Russia, you're very welcome to join this conference too. Ugh, how do I stop it?
Okay, thank you very much. Is there lovely, thank you so much. Can you see me? Is that so? Thank you so much, guys, for such a wonderful set of papers. That was really fascinating, and I've hurt my wrists trying to write down so many notes. We just learnt so much there. That was really fascinating. I have lots and lots of questions, but already in the chat, we've got lots of really fascinating questions. So I'm going to jump straight in, encourage our audience to add further questions to the chat, but I'll start off with Julia, who asked the question, I think it was of Nadia. Do Ukrainian publishers connect or cooperate with each other for potentially more opportunities to achieve translations?
I'm monitoring some news channel about the literature, children's literature, for example, Chitoma, and I can see that in the case of urgent situation, for example, when the whole print run is destroyed because of shelling or something like this one, all publishers are united and ask their readers, their followers to buy or to support this publishing house, which run was book run was destroyed, to help by ordering the books and collecting the money and so on. But I can't say that there is any organized collaboration between Ukrainian publishers' house. At least we don't have this question during the interview, so I can't say. It's mostly about psychological support and financial support in the case of in some dangerous cases.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I will move on. Claudia asks, what is funding like for Ukrainian library? What is funding like for Ukrainian libraries at present? Are they encouraged to acquire books in Ukrainian, and particularly children's books?
Thank you for the question. And I would say that now time is tough for Ukrainian libraries now because they don't have, because of the war, they don't have funding during the war. And all new books which they have, they are donated from international partners, organization programs, or from individual charitable organizations. And so they don't have too much new books nowadays. But at the same time, all Russian language literature has been completely removed from the libraries, so that readers now in Ukraine don't have any access to Russian-speaking literature. Maybe Birgitte also would.
Yeah, perhaps I just want to add to this that it goes in this purging of libraries goes in both directions, because in the occupied territories the same thing happens with the Ukrainian language collections, that the occupation force wiped them out of the Russian of the libraries where the Russians have the control now. And I think it's nothing specific to the Russian-Ukraine war. It's a pattern that we also know from, for example, the war in the Balkan Wars in the 90s, with the destruction of like Croatian versus Serbian library collections. But in the interviews, the publishers also mentioned that before 22, the Ukrainian Book Institute, this governmentally funded institution, they had kind of library purchase scheme, so they could fund publishers to make higher print runs of Ukrainian language books, children's books, for library purchases. So it was a kind of, it was to support both the children's book publishers to publish more in Ukrainian language, but also to support, to increase the collections of Ukrainian language literature in the children's book libraries. But after 22, when the whole like national economy has turned into a war economy, all funding is shorter, and now the publishers, if they get support, they only get their like direct costs covered for these library purchases.
Thank you so much. I will move on to the next question from a colleague, Ines Kinko, at the University of Helsinki, who's got a couple of questions which seem really, really interesting. And the first question is, in your opinion, how do these translated children's books mediate collective trauma for young audiences? And can translation in this case act as a form of narrative therapy or re-traumatization or something else? And then the second question is, could you comment on whether these books under analysis balance the representation of violence and the preservation of sort of children's emotional safety? So is it possible to witness the formation of some kind of emerging translingual memory of the war through children's fictional writings? So I open that to you guys to respond to those interesting questions.
I would start, I think, yes, that in all the publishers who took part in the interview, they mentioned that children's books about the war they don't. They are not selling good, so it's not something for commercial goal. That their main goal is documentation and of the war and of the experience of the war during the war. But at the same time, all of them mention that they are responsible not to rise in hate, not to re-traumatize young people, children, and people generally. Therefore, a lot of publisher houses, they don't publish war-themed literature. They have, for example, in their portfolio only 1 or 2 books which they are completely sure that it wouldn't re-traumatize young people and young readers. But at the same time, a lot of them said that the Russia-Ukrainian war is not the first in the world, yes. And there are some classical literature which could be translated into Ukrainian to help young people to process the trauma. So it was this point of view as well. And also we have a new trend in children literature in Ukraine. A lot of publishing houses cooperate with psychologists, and they require psychological expertise, or often there are psychologists who are co-authors of the book, especially when we speak about the war-themed book for children. And a lot of them, for example, Svetlana Rose is very famous Ukrainian psychologist who has written at least 2 her books I know which were published after 2022. So, and also I would say that our collection of books can prove that there are no any abuse, visual abuse on the illustration. So both, as I understand, authors, illustrators and publishers, they are responsible by understanding their audience, that there are young people, there are children, and it's impossible to re-traumatize them with some picture of abuse or something like this one.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating answer there. Shall I move on to the next question? We have a question from Svetlana to Ekaterina, and they ask how many or what kind of Russian children's books have been translated into other languages after 2022. Could you give it a bit of a sense of how that's working right now?
Well, I can't vouch for exact number of books because I need to do a little disclaimer. My thesis is not about translations, but
yeah.
it is very tricky right now to sell rights to Europe. There's definitely a few books about war, like migration narratives. They were translated into several languages, like English, German, Italian, but that's probably based due to the publisher having their branch in Europe, and also due to the author and the illustrator also being in Europe, so already in exile. So it gives a different positioning to the book promotion. There were a few non-fiction picture books translated, just general picture books, but again, as far as my memory is correct, all the authors, illustrators are somewhere in exile. There was one case of a book from Kazakhstan, like a middle grade fantasy, but it was originally written in English, in Russian, but it was promoted as something not from Imperial Russia, but from Kazakhstan. So that was picked up. So I think there is focus on promoting minority languages right now, even if it's some ex-Soviet republics. But yeah, I don't think I know of other examples, but I will be happy if somebody can share other examples if they're aware of.
Thank you so much. I might jump in. I've got quite a few questions, but I did sort of wonder, and this might be a difficult question to answer, but I was curious if, because I know, Birgitte, you said very pointed, you make a good point that you're working on books that are being published right now. So it's hard to have that kind of retrospective view or sense of the shape of things. But do you get a sense of there being any books that are sort of particularly resonant from your collection, ones that are exporting very well or that are selling very well within Ukraine or kind of proving very popular, perhaps recurring a lot in public debate or discussions? Are there any of these books that are really resonating more than others, perhaps?
Well, I think at the international market, there was like a peak of interest in Ukrainian children's books in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion. And the sellers for translation at the international markets that were primarily like artistic picture books, and they were produced also for an international audience because picture books has this like the universal visual language and can speak to an audience across borders, whereas some of them like heroic or national narratives, they are very difficult to sell or translate because the implied reader is a Ukrainian child. But I think your question about like war literature and the making this that it's literature that is created here and now somehow also relates to this question we got from Helsinki about, is it possible that a translingual memory of the war can emerge through children's war-themed literature? And I think it's this question of, is war-themed literature, is that for children? Is it like a universal? Is the war experience a universal experience that all humankind can relate to, no matter in which country and what language they are situated? Or is the war experience so tied to the immediate proximity to a combat zone or to a war zone? I mean, some of the Ukrainian publishers stated in the interviews that the authentic documentary war-themed books that are produced are perhaps too hard to read for children who are in the immediate proximity to or experience the war right outside their windows. And they suggested that this type of like documentary witness literature is perhaps written for a future generation, or for displaced children who are abroad who need an explanation of what has happened. But the publishers suggested that, you need a distance either in time or in space to actually be able to process this literature. And then you would find other positions, especially, I believe, from psychologists or from child psychologists, who would say that that it's not the war-themed literature that re-traumatize children. Children already have the traumas inside through the experiences that they have had, and like silencing those experiences or not wanting to address them or open the book and read with them is that is what is the re-traumatization, that you don't get a language, or that you don't provide children with a language to talk about what has happened. I don't know, it got a bit far.
No, these are huge questions and they're absolutely fascinating. And in some ways, it kind of reminds me of some of the discussions that I've seen publishers having in the immediate aftermath of World War II about what their responsibility is towards children. And, you know, they sort of develop whole legal structures to kind of enforce that sense of responsibility on publishers who, well, you know, they're in the business of making children's books. Why would they understand these incredibly complex and emotionally fraught and very difficult questions? So I think that's really fascinating. Patricia, do you have a question? I think your internet is perhaps more secure.
Yes, I'm so sorry. My street in Athens, Greece is under construction, so my internet dropped. But I think my question follows up really nicely from Birgitte's very, very beautiful and powerful response there. As a partner of Millet Publishing, we publish bilingual children's books in English in 17 different languages, from Arabic to French, Italian, Somali. And in the past 2 years, we've had a lot of demand to publish in English Ukrainian. And in the first years, what we did was we said, well, we'd like to advocate in the first instance to have more books from Ukraine and Ukrainian published in English, right? So our point of view was that it would be really good to have the voices from Ukraine represented in the United States and England and so forth. And now we're, considering to publish in English Ukrainian. And it's interesting. I think now that's a sign that the populations of refugees are seen as more settled. There is an interest to take care of these populations, these children, and so forth. But in the first instance, it was quite fraught because we felt our first allegiance was to get more books from Ukraine published. And we also had an experience in Chicago this summer of classrooms that have Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, and a real interest to have books in Ukrainian alongside Russian. So that's just to provide some kind of extraterritorial context for multilingual publishing, what's happening.
Thank you so much. Do you want to respond, or is there anything that sort of strikes you, resonates there? Or?
Yes, of course, the language issue has become so supercharged or so politicized, but children who are displaced from Eastern region are often bilingual, right? And then the question is also with the question of languages, that what language do you use when you read with your child at home? And I don't know, Ekaterina, I don't know if you want to mention the case study that you have worked with, where a book was published in both languages. Or...
You mean the Wolfka who settled the bomb? But again, I feel like this case is slightly out of time frame now. I mean, at least for this discussion.
Or Nadia, you had this, you did this interviews with Ukrainian families in Denmark about language shifts and.
Question of language is really difficult and at the same time significant for all Ukrainians. It doesn't depend whether they stay nowadays, I mean, in Ukraine or abroad, because the results of our interview with Ukrainian mothers in Denmark who have children preschool age, they decided to change the language to Ukrainian, even if they are from Russian-speaking regions, and even if before 2022 they used to speak Russian, because they take it as a form of political support, of identification, of support of Ukraine and Ukrainians, people who stay in Ukraine. Language can be your political choice to show who are you and why do you use this language, despite it could be painful. And some of the mothers, they described, for example, how do they struggle with language, because it's like to use foreign language every time. It's not easy when you try to find the right words to express yourself or your thoughts. But at the same time, of course, there is a part of Ukrainian society who speak Russian, and they think that, and they share this thought that they are Ukrainians, and no matter what language do they use. And I think that it's also important to understand that, yes, there are Russian speaking Ukrainian from some regions.
Thank you so much. I'm aware we had one last question, but I think really Birgitte has already answered that question. So I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair to just ask one last tiny question, because before we close. I was really interested to learn about the corpus, the sort of collection of these books that you're building, and that feels like a really important collection. I just wondered what kind of plans you have for its. I can see you're going to sort of work with an organization to ensure it's catalogued and preserved, but are there any other things you feel you're going to uses you're going to make of it, or what your kind of or hopes or ideas you would love to do with it?
Well, we have to find out. That's going to be the next project, I guess. But it's not like we collaborate with the Pedagogical University in Denmark has an international library collection. It's not a huge collection, but it's there, and they have cataloged most of the books that we have collected. And the idea is just to make it accessible both for public and also for researchers later on. But it's not like we don't have a huge funding budget to make a online presentation or digitalize the books, or so for now it's really just a library collection, but it would be lovely to make a follow-up project later on, or perhaps create a book exhibition, whether it should be a physical exhibition or an online exhibit, that we will find out over time. But for now we are mostly occupied with collecting the research data and publishing the research results, and then a dissemination project could follow this project later on.
Thank you. Yeah, and as Patricia says, I think it reminds me so much of the kind of the IBI and International Youth Library project, and it sort of feels like that's a really kind of clear connection there. So anyway, watch this space. But thank you so much to all three of our speakers, and also to everyone who's joined us. But thank you so much for sharing the results of your really important and fascinating project with us. That was wonderful. And we'll record this and we'll share the recording, and thank you so much for your generosity with that. And yes, lovely to see you and to learn about it, and good luck with the rest of it and the future iterations. That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
From outside in world as well, to the speakers and to Sophie and to the participants here today. Thank you so much.
And thank you to you for organizing this, and thank you for all the wonderful and inspiring questions we got from the audiences.
All right, I have stopped the recording. We're off.